Hello and welcome to Sam Not So Wise. My name is Sam. We are nearing the end of the year. Where the hell does time go? So it is important to wrap up what I've read to see if any of these books have any chance of sneaking into that end of the year top 10. Very important top 10 that is, which I'll probably do at the start of 2025 to be honest, just FYI. So I read 5 books this month, which is quite good. I'm pretty happy with that. 3 of them were sci-fi and 2 were fantasy. Now, I am still a little bit ill, so apologize for any sniffy horribleness, you know. So with that and much further ado, let's talk about what I read in November. Now, I normally do my wrap-ups in chronological order in which I read them, but today I'm going to bunch together 2 books because they make up a duology, so that just makes sense. And that is Earthseed by Octavia Butler, so Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, which I read on Kindle. Now, I did actually make a full spoiler-free review video on this series, so if you want more in-depth thoughts, I'll put a link to that in the description. But I'll just kind of quickly summarize it now for those who don't want to, can't be bothered, or whatever. So this is a dystopian fiction which is set in 2024, at least at the start of the story. So it is very relevant to now. It is told in the form of journal entries by Lauren Olamina. I think that's how you say it. I'm not sure. I am sorry. And it is set in a world where the poor and rich divide is gargantuan. Crime is rife. The police are extremely corrupt and the climate is screwed. Not completely screwed, but very much on the way there, as if that would ever happen. And the story centers around Lauren and the small community in which she lives in California. They're basically just trying to survive in this cruel and dangerous world and uphold a sense of community and what they consider to be the right way forward. At some point in the story, the focus shifts after a devastating event within the community, and Lauren is pushed away from there and further into California. And a huge part of the story, a very integral part of the story from which the series gets its name, is Earthseed, which is the religion that Lauren basically founds within this series. And this religion, it's described as God is change. So it's based around change. God isn't a deity. It upholds that change is inevitable, the only inevitable, and we can steer change in a positive way if we so wish to. And the best way to do that is by educating ourselves as best as possible. And eventually the destiny of the religion is travel to the stars and furthering humanity to the reaches of space. Now, this book is not very heavy on plot, and it's also not very heavy on character work. It is very much a theme-driven book. It is extremely philosophical, very heady. So if you're looking for fast-paced plots and exciting action, you're not going to get it here, but it is extremely deep and extremely thought-provoking, and it is excellent. I absolutely loved these series. Now, the themes are extremely plentiful. You could go on forever about the themes within this series, but the biggest ones I would like to tell you are religion, obviously, race and gender, education, the importance of community, and corruption within politics. Now, this is not for the faint of heart. These books are extremely dark, basically trigger warnings for anything you can think of. But hope is present through the religion and the empathy that the main character has and the building of community within the stories. But it is very dark and very depressing at times, but I love that kind of stuff, so this was right up my street. It won't knock off my favorite dystopian book, which happens to be my favorite book ever, which is 1984, but I do recognize that they are trying to do extremely different things, and they are both excellent examples of what they are doing. So yes, I highly recommend Earthseed. Check out my full review if you want further thoughts. By the way, I'm no longer rating books anymore because I just find that my feelings and my ratings change over time, so it's kind of pointless, so I'll just tell you what I feel now, and I feel this is amazing. So the book I read in between those 2 books was The Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne, the third book in the Bloodsworn Saga and the final book, the concluding book of the trilogy. Now, I've been a busy little bee on YouTube recently, and there's going to be lots of links in the description. Feel free to ignore them, but find them if you want to learn more. I did a series review for the Bloodsworn Saga itself, so check that out. And I was also in a discussion video, both non-spoiler and spoiler, for this book and the series in total, with Philip Chase, the brothers Gwynne, and the author John Gwynne himself. It was absolutely brilliant. I loved it. There is almost 40 minutes of non-spoiler discussion, so you should still check that video out anyway. Now, this is a last book in a series, so I obviously can't say too much about it, but I can tell you that I really enjoyed it. So in this book, the pace ramps up a notch. Now, the other books were already quite fast-paced, but they had a lot more calmer moments compared to this book. This is pedal to the metal the whole way, basically. There are lots of huge epic scenes and a lot of singular battles as well. And there are a lot of largely emotional scenes full of vengeance and loss. Now, the book excels, though, in my opinion, in its final exploration of the themes that we've been discussing in the previous two books. Those specifically of othering within this world and the slavery that comes from it, but also the classic John Gwynne themes of family and found family. Now, Shadow of the Gods was probably still my favourite in the trilogy, but I found this to be an extremely fitting end to an excellent series, and I highly recommend you pick them up. None of the books are particularly long. It's a pretty good introduction to fantasy, but also excellent writing for those who are veterans. So I highly recommend this series, and Fury of the Gods was brilliant. Now, the next one was a very interesting reading experience for me, and it was a reread. So I saw that Bart from Bart's Book Space and Whitney from Secret Source of Storycraft were doing a buddy read of Use of Weapons. Now, if you've watched this channel at all, you know that Ian Banks is my favorite author, and his series, The Culture, is my favorite sci-fi series of all time. So when I saw that they were thinking of doing this, I was like, I want to join you. Because in my memory, this is my favorite book from this series. So this book is the third within the Culture series. It is a standalone like all of the books in the series. You can basically read them in any order, but I do have some recommendations. If you want to know, let me know in the comments. Now, this story follows two Special Circumstances agents. So Special Circumstances in the Culture is a very specialized branch of secretive work outside of the Culture. They basically go and meddle in other people's business, and it's seen as somewhat morally grey. So a Special Circumstances agent called Diziet Smar hires somebody called Zakalwe, who is a regular recruit for Special Circumstances, and she is basically always the one that hires him and directs him to do stuff. And they just go and do what Special Circumstances do. They go and meddle in other people's business. But the structure of this story is very fascinating. Again, I've done a video on structures within books, interesting structures, that was influenced by me reading this again. So I'll put a link in the description. So the present day story going forward is a classic Culture story where Zakalwe goes and meddles with this world that he has actually worked in before. But there are Zakalwe specific chapters that go backwards in time from the moment that we are in now. And each chapter feels like a short story as we go back in time. We know that the past haunts him in some specific way. Something horrible has happened. And each time we go further back in time, we get more and more references to what has happened. So it really keeps the intrigue up into what has caused the man to be basically who he is. And we also get a lot more context of his involvement with the Culture. Now, this book is fairly famous for its ending. There is a kind of a big reveal that completely recontextualizes what you've read for the previous 400 pages. The first time I read this, it absolutely blew my mind. Now, this time round, having people to talk with about it, we kind of agreed that we don't fully think it works, but we're still not sure. We're still ruminating about it, which is probably a good sign, really, that this book you can probably think about forever, because we don't get the full context or the full picture of this big reveal. Now, I don't need everything explained to me, but in part, some of it feels a little bit unbelievable without this added context. There seems to be a big step taken that is hard to describe. Now, we've had some theories around this, but nothing feels completely solid. And the result is that it's not as satisfying as last time. Now, maybe I was just blinded by the complete surprise last time, but this time around, that didn't happen to them who were reading it for the first time. So obviously I'm just a bit stupid. But I've kind of also come to accept that maybe we aren't supposed to really know or find out, and we can kind of piece things together ourselves if we read really closely and reread again. So I could have read this immediately again and tried to pick up some stuff, but it is a little bit confusing. So there was a bit of a strange experience. I'm sure we'll talk about it in that video later, so please check that out. Now, this book was still brilliant, still one of my favorite books of all time, because it really showcases Banks' skill as a writer. It's a genius storytelling device. It's a fascinating story. It's very emotional and fun, full of thematic depth. And yeah, even though the ending is a bit of a puzzle and may not have hit me as hard this time, this is still an excellent book and an excellent series, and you should definitely check it out. So my fifth and final book was another great book. I'm honestly not always this positive, but it has been a good month. This book did just sneak into December, but I'm not waiting till the end of December to talk about it. And that was House of Open Wounds by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, this is the second book in the Tyrant Philosophers trilogy, which will be ending in a few days with his third book. Now, this is a world where what is called the Palatine sway, which is an empire, and we follow them taking over the world one country at a time in the name of what they call perfection. Now, the first book centered around an uprising in a city that was under occupation. Now, this book was very different. It didn't follow on from that story. We only have one carryover character from that book. And we follow him as he joins a hospital in an army on the front line of the war that the Palatine sway are undertaking, trying to take over another country, one of their biggest rivals. Now, this hospital is interesting because it's made up of undesirables, at least according to the Palatine, people from other countries, users of magics, those with minor gods, and also criminals from within their own society. This is an experimental hospital made up of people who use unique gifts, and it is a very hypocritical but also typical way of the Palatine sway. What they do, they are using people that they consider to be imperfect but for their own gains. And like I said, this is a very different book to the first book. It almost acts as a standalone in a way. I think you probably could read this on its own and not really miss out on too much. I do recommend reading the first book, but you probably could read it on its own. It has a lot smaller cast and scope compared to the previous book. Before, we were following an entire city and a huge cast of characters. This is a very much smaller cast and just focused around a small section of an army, a battalion. And it's more traditional as well in a way, because the previous book, very quick chapters and lots of POVs, and we never really stick with one for a long time. This is more traditional in its structure. It is not a heavily plot-focused book. This is very much a character book. There is an overarching plot, but it is basically just one of pushing the front line of an army. It's not terribly exciting in that way. It is very much about the characters within this hospital, the hijinks they get up to, and basically how they feel, and the community. The themes of this book are very much about found family and found friends and finding people to connect with in a world where you have been completely displaced. There's a lot of focus on religion in this book and the questioning of it, losing your religion, that kind of stuff. There is a lot on the brutality of war and how grimy and horrible it really is. It is also about hypocrisy of those spreading their ideals and them doing what they want and being able to justify it in any possible way. It is obviously about imperialism, and it is about corruption of people in power. I thought this was an excellent book, heartwarming, funny, deep, and just very different to the previous book, which I find interesting, just like the culture. I love this series so far, and I'm very excited to finish it, probably next year with the final book. So I highly recommend House of Open Wounds. So what was my book of the month? I don't care about the reread rule. It is going to be Use of Weapons. I love this series so much, even with my kind of differing thoughts and having difficulty deciding how I feel about the ending. I still think this book is an absolutely marvelous achievement and you should read it. So I'll quickly tell you about my December TBR, which is actually quite set in stone. I'm starting with The Left Hand of Darkness, which I actually started yesterday. Now, this is another reread for me, but the book club that I organise here in Reykjavik decided to read this, so I was more than happy to pick this up again. The next book I will read is the obvious one, which everybody's going to be reading, and that is Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson, the final book in the Stormlight Archive. I'm very much looking forward to seeing how this one ends this arc of the series. I really hope he pulls it off. And we're all feeling like that. So that's obviously a humongous read, and that's going to take up most of the month. Now, to kind of keep my brain fresh, at the same time, I'm going to be reading The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories by Ken Liu. I have been wanting to read Ken Liu for a long time. I'm going to be reading Dandelion Dynasty, I'm English, Samuel, Dandelion Dynasty next year. So I want to warm my Ken Liu brain up with his short story collection, this very famous book. Now, if I have time at the end of the month, I'm going to read Robert Silverberg's Dying Inside. I've said this every month that I've been on YouTube so far, but that is the one I'm going to read if I have time. And that I cannot see myself reading any more than that. So that is what I have in store for December. So that's it for the November wrap up. Let me know what you've read in November. If you've read any of these books, any thoughts on them or any of the ones that I've got coming up. If you've made it this far into the video, I thank you so much and really appreciate it. Hit the like button. Subscribe if you are new to the channel, and that's it for now. I'll see you in another video soon. Goodbye.